Hello everybody, I hope that you like our beautiful city and that you enjoy EAC13 conference as well. I want to tell you a few words about our preliminary traceological and experimental archaeology studies on wooden artifacts from subneolithic sites in Šventoj in Lithuania. The traceological studies of prehistoric wooden artifacts are one of the weaker developed branches of this method. The singular studies of this type have been discussed in a few articles, some of which are included on this slide. This situation is due to many factors. First of all, prehistoric wooden artifacts are extremely rare. The second thing is that wood is a very soft organic material, which means that the post-deposition processes destroy its surface very fast, so they destroy the potential technological and functional traces as well. It makes traceological analysis very often impossible. Last but not least, prehistoric wooden artifact must usually be subjected to the conservation process immediately after excavation. Its manner and course are also of a key importance for the possibility of conducting traceological research. As you can see, there are many factors that make the traceological analysis of wooden artifacts difficult. So the question should be asked, to what extent such studies are possible at all? Access to wooden artifacts from the unique complex of subneolithic sites in Šventoj allowed us to attempt to answer. The complex of sites at Šventoj, Lithuania was discovered in 1966 during irrigation works carried out in the region. Human occupation phases at different sites were C14 dated to different periods. However, all of the artifacts discussed here comes from the site dated Subneolithic to the period between 3200 and 2500 Cal BC. These sites were interpreted as habitation sites, refuse layers, fishing stations, and possibly pile-dwelling settlements. Excavation carried out at sites in Šventoj led to collect a rich number of artifacts from organic raw material, a large part of which were various types of wooden products. And here you have the examples of wooden artifacts discovered in Šventoj, like pestles, Leicester prongs, shafts, paddles, handles of vessels, handles of axes, sinkers, and bows and arrows. These artifacts are very important as the contextual material for our studies on function of Osseous artifacts from Šventoj and generally the function of sites, so we decided to take a closer look at them to answer a question posted at the beginning of the presentation. So the question about the usefulness for traceological analysis and the cognitive potential resulting from such research. So we started our analysis, which was connected to studies on wood taxa identification and additional AMS datings. As you can imagine, the analysis was very difficult for the reasons noticed in the introduction. Still, finally, next to a huge amount of post-depositional and conservation traces, we have identified some types of destructions that can be considered technological and functional traces. The technological destructions we observed were similar to the analogous traces at Osseous products, and they were usually the results of such activities as scraping, planing, chiseling, and chopping or hewing. I will show you some examples of such traces right now. Here you have examples of scraping traces observed on a paddle and traces of planing visible on a shaft. And the same type of traces readable on other wooden artifacts. On this slide, you can see the traces of hewing here that we observed on one of the artifacts, and very typical for scraping or planing of bone products, so-called chatter marks, that you can see here. And here, the technological traces resulting from two methods of making the perforation in wooden products, puncturing here and drilling here. And at the end, at this slide, you can see the results of a very precise and detailed treatment of a narrow shaft, in this case forming of the base end of an arrow, which includes preparation of the recess for the wrap that you can see here, and the notch for the bowstring that you can see here. All the traces that I showed were replicated during the experimental works conducted, so we have the confirmation for the observation made during the microscopic analysis. And what about the usual traces we observed? It was a much more complicated analysis, and the results were worse than in the case of technology. However, we have noticed some possible destruction of this type that can be considered the first step to interpreting the function of some wooden artifacts from Szwentoj. I will show you here the most interesting examples, starting from pestles. On these tools, very different traces of use were observed, but usually they can be considered impact traces. We have observed, for example, intense crushing traces and packness that strongly damaged the wood fibers, as shown in this example. We also observed various types of post-impact dents, the origin of which is not clear for us yet, like the ones that you can see on this photo. The working edge of one pestle is clearly smoothed in its tip part, which is documented at these two photos. We preliminarily interpreted these traces as resulting from the grinding activity. On the surfaces of several pestles, very interesting and probably functional in origin recesses are visible, within which the wood fibers are crushed. This is something what you can see on these photos. The authors of the Szwentoj excavations interpret these tools as nutcrackers. So, we decided to try to replicate all of the mentioned traces and test the functional hypothesis put forward about their genesis. We have made different experiments. Here you have the ones where the experimental pestles are used to hit in wood or antler wedges in the process of debulking. These experiments were conducted during the first International Camp of Experimental Archaeology that is discussed at the conference by Justyna Orłowska.
Okay. Next one. Wait. Wasp there.
And the results of these experiments from the traceological point of view. As you can see, the traces observed on the working edge of one of the artifacts from Szwentoj and the pestle used during presented experiments are very similar. We have also conducted experiments involving breaking hazelnuts with one of the experimental pestles, as suggested by the authors of the excavation in Szwentoj. As you can see, our pestle was very effective. And here you have the results of this experiment from the traceological point of view. As you can see, the traces on the experimental tool are different than those of the artifact from Szwentoj. The conducted experimental works resulted in the recreation of the recess visible at the artifact, and you can see it here. Still, characteristic cracks also developed on the experimental tool, which are not present on the artifact. Nevertheless, we do not rule out the correctness of the hypothesis put forward by the Szwentoj researchers about this type of tools, as the differences in traces may result from the degree of drying and the type of wood. This problem will be solved by further experimental works. An extremely interesting type of artifact which occurred quite numerously at the Szwentoj sites are objects with two recesses carved on the poles. You can see them here, and here, which are interpreted, of course, the tools as the part of axe handles. Here you can see the interpretation of the way that they could be used and the example of the stone axes found in Szwentoj. At first, we were very skeptical about the hypothesis regarding the potential way of use of these artifacts. Our doubts were raised by the lack of any impact traces like crashing opaqueness inside the recesses, which seemed to be a natural result of the suggested way of working with these products. On the contrary, the interiors of the recesses bore smoothing traces, the origin of which we did not understand, and this is something that you can see on these photos. So we decided to replicate the original tools according to the suggestion of the authors of the excavations and to conduct some experiments with wood chopping, which are illustrated on this slide. Their results were different than we expected. First of all, the axe handles turned out to be highly effective, much better in many respects than shafts made of one piece of wood, which we had tested many times before. Secondly, traceological studies of the recesses for axe and shaft on the experimental tools did not reveal any impact traces. On the contrary, the wood surface was clearly smoothed, as in the case of artifacts. So initially, it is possible to confirm the functional hypothesis put forward about this artifact with high probability. And this is something that you can see here. This is the smoothing, and it is also visible here. So no impact traces, only the smoothed surfaces. In the end, we would like to show you an extremely interesting artifact that keeps us awake at night, possibly the oldest known direct proof for using fire by friction method in prehistory. It is a straight stick about 40 centimeters long with smoothing and bending on one end. This is something that you can see here on these photos, on which we observed, as it seems, very characteristic traces of rotation that are visible on this photo. Of course, we've made experiments with fire by friction methods many times before, and here is an example. So we decided to compare the traces on our experimental spindles to the ones visible on the surface of the artifact. As you can see, they are quite similar. We need to verify some observation and suggestions yet. We would like to make some additional experiments and more detailed user analyses, including, first of all, the ones concerning the influence of the conservation process of the traces of discussed type. We also need to make the EMS dating for the artifacts. However, its preliminary user analysis results seems very promising. So, concluding our work so far, we can say that the conducted research confirmed the possibility of identifying various types of technological and traces on prehistoric wooden artifacts. That's one. The conducted experimental and traceological studies also confirmed the possibility of identifying and interpreting traces of using prehistoric wooden objects. However, these analyses require further studies. As one of the most important conclusions, we can also say that in traceological studies of wooden objects, it is necessary to analyze precisely the impact of post-deposition processes on the state of preservation and changes that arose due to the conservation. We are currently working in this area also experimentally. That's all. Thank you for your attention.